Got a great photo of the kind of zoo escapes were quite common. In this case, this poor puma got loose. They organised a hunting party and shoot it, and everyone's like, woohoo, we get to be like we're in India. They do a big hunting party, and they shoot this poor puma and then tromp it around town, and away you go. But it's a nice example of the kind of stuff that's happening, not infrequently, and it was a wonderful adventure for people when it happened. Perhaps not so much for the poor cat. Of course, I thought I should mention the US mascot theory because it's the most common one you get. First thing I looked up, of course, was trying to make sense of this story. Did have servicemen with mascots? Most certainly. But as far as the government's concerned, and as far as the papers are concerned in World War II, their fear was not American mascots, but Australians. And their particular fear was you had large numbers of Australians coming back from North Africa with all kinds of pets and animals and things. You also had Australians going back and forth to Asia after 1942, bringing back animals. So there was one story of this poor tiger. Poor animal. The Japanese officer had gone tiger hunting in China, had shot a tiger, taken its cub as a pet. He got stationed in New Guinea. He got overrun by the Australians. This Australian serviceman took the tiger cub as a pet. He packed it in his rucksack, he emptied it out, everything else, so he could have this poor tiger cub that he drugged up and stuck in there. He got back to Townsville where they found the tiger and shot it. Nice story there. I'm trying to remember the name of the ship. Australian serviceman there with the leopard. So lots of these stories, but the real fear for government was, at the time, was Australians bringing things back. Certainly had cases of American mascots, but they were by and large better policed. The other thing was, they had one story, for instance, of a ship that came into port, and when Customs searched it, they found 1,650 exotic animals on board, including bear cubs and a deer. The thing that was a real clincher, though, was in July of 1942, where the report was that the servicemen had been, they came into Perth, Fremantle area. They had little monkeys with them as pets, and the monkeys had rabies and yellow fever. And the Australian government made a ruling that Australian servicemen were not permitted to have mascots except for specifically regimentally approved ones. However, that this ruling did not apply to foreign servicemen in Australia, which set off quite a lot of bitterness, I might add. So in really looking at the weight of the historical evidence, the big anxiety at the time was Australian servicemen, not Americans. One story we seem to have weight, and it's discussed downstairs, is that of the 22nd Bomber Group that was stationed briefly at Mill. And there was interviews there with a woman by the name of Irene Adensall, and there was another guy who was a security guard, who both told the story of this puma being brought in the few weeks they were there at Mill in 1942, April, where this puma was brought in with 4 cubs. The animal wasn't happy, it was causing problems. They were asked by the Australian government to put the animal down. The servicemen couldn't bear the thought, and one story has them releasing the animal on the portion to Hamilton Road. The other story has them releasing it at Roses Gap or Halls Gap, depending on how you do the story. It's the only one I've really found. Though, interestingly, the first time I get a record of the US mascot myth was in 1947 in the Ngari lion panic in Queensland. And that story has usual thing of sheep disappearing. Some of these don't look like the ones that dogs do. They bring in the guy from a circus, Perry Brothers Circus, to go and look at the animal kills, and he said, this doesn't look like a lion like we've got, these look like mountain lions. He then raises the idea that maybe the US servicemen had brought them over. Coincidentally, one of the air units stationed there was also the 22nd, 22nd Bombardment Group. So there's an interesting link there, but certainly nothing definite. When the Americans, which have been approached a number of times, the line you tend to get is, we left the Philippines, Japanese just behind us, so to speak. We spent, 6 weeks at sea. We arrived in, we were shuttled on trains, shipped out to the countryside and stationed with locals. Where could we store a big cat? That's the line they tend to run. But nonetheless, yes, US servicemen, I've got a nice picture here of an 8-week-old lion cub with the UN 4th Marine Division. But these mascots were very common. There was actually a guy who was caught trying to bring back a pair of servals into Australia, black servals. And he had hopes of breeding them before he got caught by customs. So it is happening, but I find it really interesting to focus all the attention on the Americans. And look, to be honest, I think there's an element of anti-Americanism in that it's easy to blame the foreigner rather than look at our own conduct and practice. It's also I think tapping into the bitterness I think people felt when Australian servicemen were banned for having these pets, but Americans weren't. There's a lot of papers, though, about the fate of these mascots. There are stories like A Dog Without a Country, the unhappy fate of Australian mascots, where lots of animals that were brought back that soldiers loved had been put down. And they were quite upset about that, but then I have to say I have a lot of sympathy with the Australian government point of view if we don't want to have rabies and yellow fever getting loose. Because that was, in Victorian government documents, that was their big anxiety. Another story I'll bring up, of course, is the legend of giant feral cats. This one from 2005, if I recall correctly, the Kurt Engels cat. When I say it's a textbook case of false perspective, I mean it's actually used in Melbourne University as an example of false perspective. That is where you take the whole thing in the same focus and you hold the animal closer. A lot of complex stories of this, but when they did DNA samples of the bits of tail that were remaining, they came up with, feral cat. A lot of stories of giant feral cats. They first start popping up in the Sentinel and Tiger Panic. Feral cats were here since at least the goldfields, but the Rabbit Control Act of 1883 established by the Acclimatisation Society and other groups large colonies of feral cats to be released into the Australian bush with the idea that they'd eat all the rabbits, which didn't really work out, as we all know. But in the Sentinel Tiger Panic, one theory a guy put forward after he claimed he caught an enormous feral cat in a trap was feral cats breeding in the wild and reaching enormous sizes. And we still have that story today. I can find enormous splits. I talked to the environmental scientists at the University of Ballarat, and quite a lot of them will say, yeah, we get big feral cats, and they'll tell me a theory why. I get other scientists who tell me, no, not in real life. What I can suggest is you certainly get to some extent larger than normal feral cats, but not like ones that eat sheep. There's certainly ones that you'd look at and think, well, that's a modern cat. But perfectly within normal model range. But certainly that story's been pervasive for a very, very long time. And one thing I want to emphasise, it was really obvious. I came into this expecting I was just going to have to look at World War II, but these stories have been around since first colonisation. Stories of big cats, cat-like predators. Another theory I want to bring, of course, mainland thylacines. Richard Marks brought it up in the Sentinel Tiger Panic, but this has research come back time and time again, particularly in South Australia. Again, since first colonisation, the idea of it being small pockets. This particular story, Simon can give you more detail on it, is a nice example. They found this in a cave in Western Australia. Carbon dating dated it to about 5,000 years old. It also had, I think a guy by the name of Athol Douglas studied it and found blowfly larvae, which then meant it became quite a contested thing. If it's blowfly larvae, it should be very recent. A lot of theories back and forth with it, but nonetheless that story pervades to the present. And indeed, even relatively locally, you get stories of zebra bulls and so on in early colonisation of Victoria and South Australia. What it actually was, Dorothy Tunbridge, in her book History of the Flinders Ranges Mammals, makes the argument that they may have survived a lot more recently than people have considered, as does Dr. Robert Paddle in his book The Last Thylacine, in that the amount that people had of the Flinders Ranges had a word for them. Settlers described seeing them, people described seeing the skins of them. One theory put forward was that, again, they were wiped out before people actually got a time to study the area properly. Dorothy Tunbridge argued that that actually happens quite a lot in Australian history, that the sheer speed of change to the landscape was such that many animals became extinct before we even got scientists in to work out what the hell lived there. Which meant that, you've got all these stories. So she's got a really sad story. I remember her doing an interview about this on Radio National. This Aboriginal community had this animal as a totem. And they'd never seen their totem animal before, the animal that was meant to define them. And she managed to find one in the British Museum, this little bilby thing. And she took it to them to see, and they're all like in tears, patting it, going, this is my brother. With this sense of connected to who you are, this animal that had been extinct before people had even got a chance to properly classify it, because of the sheer speed of change to the landscape. And that, to me, is the overwhelming story here, engaging with incredible change to the environment over a very rapid pace, massive change to the flora and fauna, the releasing of vast numbers of introduced species. It's incredible. Finally, to look at the contemporary era. Post-1947, the Yangara lion's the last example I can find of people going around and shooting a big dog and saying, ha ha, this is really the animal. Post then, the stories become tied to paranormalism. I've come across stories of people linking big cats to UFOs and things. I've come across stories that they're shape changes. It's become, in a sense, a very uncanny, fragmented area. Before World War II, it was treated the same as you treat any feral animal. Let's get together with some guns and go shoot the thing. Post World War II, it's become something uncanny. Like when people say they've seen something, they're very likely to get a whole heap of ridicule piled on their head. When really it's not that much more outlandish than any other feral animal that you might see. I mean, we've had definite escapes. Even recently, the recent Victorian Big Cat report noted that, from Bacchus Marsh Lion Safari Park, there were a number of big animals lost for considerable periods of time. So, have you had individual big cats loose, often for long periods of time? Sure, that's definite. If you'd seen a big cat around Bacchus Marsh in the 80s, chances are you've actually seen a big cat. That happened. Breeding population is another question altogether. The set in fiction, in the winter dark, the big cat becomes a catalyst for all sorts of people's pent-up traumas and anxieties. Anyone seen the recent film, strange film, Red Hill? Yeah. Red Hill, for instance, again features a subplot of a big cat being synonymous with the alien and dangerous nature of the Australian landscape. Really, going through the papers, every couple of years this pops up as another big panic, usually around September, and it just recycles. And usually it starts with really outlandish reporting that's completely favourable, followed by absolute ridicule immediately afterwards. Often by the same reporter, which disturbs me somewhat. Regular sightings and claimed stock losses. One thing I found going through Victorian government records, even recent ones, you get all these letters written into Joan Kerner when she's Minister of Conservation, Forests and Lands, and they're saying, from politicians, probably shouldn't name names I guess, but they're writing in saying, we've got a really big cat problem down here in Geelong or the Otways or around Bendigo. Can you do something about it? And she's writing letters back saying, we don't have any expertise in how to deal with this. If someone ever comes up with something definite, then we can. There's also problems like People magazine at one point in 1986, I think it was, so I'm not entirely sure off the top of my head, offered a $20,000 reward for anyone shooting a big cat in the vicinity of Bendigo. Police are then writing very angry letters saying they've had people doing things like discharging firearms on the Calder Highway, what they thought might have been a big cat at dusk. A bit scary. So, this is popping up time and time and time again, still to this day. And it's the pattern of sightings and pattern of stock losses remain the same. Stories of an animal with broken neck, split up the middle, picked bare overnight, those sort of stories pop up over and over again. It's the sort of thing Simon can give you much more detail on than I can. Very much tied to the issue of lost stock. I've come to the opinion it's almost a symbol, if you like, of whether you're a rural Victorian or an urban Victorian. You look at parliamentary records. Rural politicians tend to take it very seriously. They write lots of letters into the Premier. Politicians in Melbourne say, that's just absolutely ridiculous and silly and laugh at it. And that, even with talking to the general populace, I find that it's a very clear urban country divide. Indeed, it's not even a Labor Liberal national thing. We find it the same with Labor politicians, Liberal and national ones. A few weird conspiracy theories, I must say. One line I came across at a do in Dunkeld I went to, and they had this guy hoping to get into Parliament there. Again, probably shouldn't say names, but his line was, let's see if I can get this quote right. Big cats are out there, the Victorian Labor government knows about it, but they don't want you to know about it, because if they were there, that would give you a legitimate reason to own large calibre semi-automatic firearms. And that would fit with the agenda of disarming the Victorian people. I mean, he was preaching to the choir, this is a particular hunting dude, but I was going, okay, hey, other conspiracy theories. There's a story I came across that Melbourne Uni has big cats and they keep them underground in a secret lab facility. Another story I came across, actually this one was targeted at me. I mentioned on a web forum that I had a cousin who works as a geneticist. And then I started getting these really angry emails followed by phone calls saying that, what happened to those bits of puma I sent for DNA analysis to Monash Uni? What's he done with them? My cousin works with RNA in viruses and stem cells. What would I do with puma skulls? Aside from perhaps what Simon does there with his demo, maybe I might reenact a gothic version of the Muppet Show or something, I don't know. But nonetheless, it's very interesting because you get work for academia, you get that whole target labelling from big government, and I'd be absolutely rapt to find some really cool definitive material. It'd be wonderful. But nonetheless, those stories come out, and if you like, one of the awful things about it is it ends up tarring the whole area with the same brush. So for me, I very much try to sort of sidestep that whole believer skeptic thing and look at what it says about Australians and our engagement with the landscape. And I think it's a very profound story to be told. And indeed, when people talk about seeing big cats, it's not like a current thing, it's not a World War II thing. This is as well entrenched in Australian folklore as anything. It's as well entrenched in Australian folklore as Ned Kelly and Gallipoli. And it's a fundamental part of our historic and cultural identity. So thank you very much. Any questions? Yeah?
When you showed the picture of the cat shot by Kurt Engel,
yes.
On the left there was another picture of an Indigenous man holding a very
very large feral cat. Yeah.
Do you have any details about that?
That particular picture I took from the ABC, which ran a story about large feral cats in the Northern Territory. Feral cats are the guys holding like moggy size, but large to normal moggy size. Look, I've seen plenty of skins like that sort of thing. I mean, I don't think that's the issue. The issue is, do you get ones that you might mistake for a panther, like that? Well, I'd be very worried about a moggy that big.
There was one shot out near Anarchy in the 70s. They thought they'd shot a fox, was actually a large-sized feral cat. There was an article in the Advertiser, but I can't remember the year.
I'll be interested, if you can remember the year, it'd be interesting to see that. I mean, you get even domestic breeds of cats, like Chaucer cats. You get nice photos on the web of a Chaucer cat with its paws here, and it's quite a big domestic cat, but still it's a domestic cat. Yeah. Sorry.
Have you had any experiences with big cats?
Not really. Look, to be honest, I had one experience once. That's actually partly what kicked this off. I was driving through Anarchy through the land from Geelong. I was studying at Deakin University at the time as an undergraduate. This would be like, 17 years ago now. And this is, again, I can talk about the problem of sightings and you look at it from a skeptic psychological point of view, especially myself. That bit where you come up around a corner and there's sort of like the ferry park on the hill up on your right-hand side. Yep, and you're heading north towards Ballan. And basically, I got sick of doing the Ballarat to Geelong drive the normal way, so I wanted to go a more scenic route. So I got there, and in the middle of the road for a second, in the headlights, was what seemed to me, at first I thought it was a dog. And then I got close, and I went, oh my God, that looks like a big freaking cat. It looked at me and I got this big flash of yellow, and then went low, went across the road, scapula doing that sort of thing, tail up, and I looked at it and went, oh my God, what have I seen? And the problem is, it was about 2 in the morning. I'm seeing it at a long distance in my headlights of my car. Humans are awful at judging scale, and I ended up going, what I took from that was, I didn't know what I'd actually seen, but I took from that people legitimately seeing what they think what they say they're seeing. Like, whether that is objectively what you think it is another question, but nonetheless you can have that experience. And I think it's an important thing to mention too when people heap ridicule on someone who thought they've seen a big cat or whatever. Even if it's not what they thought they've seen, you can still legitimately have that experience and it can seem like that to you. Another example I bring of that problem, when I was doing this project, I was driving along down through the Otways and looking on the side of the road as I'm driving along in the ferns, I thought for a second I saw a bear. It was like a grizzly bear. And I was like, what the heck's that? And fortunately the animal stayed still. It was a feral pig. But I'd seen, glancing at the corner of my eye, a brown hairy back. Now, what my brain went to culturally what's most significant to me. A bear. I've heard about bears since I was watching Winnie the Pooh and things when I was a little kid. So that's the first thing that jumped in my head. My imagination filled the gaps. I'm seeing it, for a split second, so I'm awful at judging scales, so it seemed bigger. And so this feral pig's back for a second seemed to me like a bear. Now, because I was able to slow the car down and have a good look, I could see it was a feral pig, but if that animal had immediately dashed for the bush, I probably would have gone off thinking I'd seen a bear. So the tricky thing is you can't speak for someone else's experience. You don't know what they've seen. Someone will often tell you, I know what I've seen, but you can't tell that because you can't be inside their head. And human perception, if you talk to any police officers, is notoriously imprecise and difficult. It also gets shaped by our imagination filling gaps and that sort of thing. So this thing in Anarchy, whatever it was, or even if it was anything, at the time it made me think, okay, people are legitimately having that experience, whatever the nature of that experience is. To actually know, you need things like scat, tracks, DNA, specimen. But that's really something that sort of kicked it off, and when I saw that, it sort of course, with Thirsty My Brain did culture, it would go back to the yarns I've heard in Boy Scouts.
Did it look towards you and you got the
Yeah, it did. I saw a big flash
What
of
colour
yellow.
eye shine?
Yellow. Yeah.
What colour eye shine?
Yellow, yeah.
Oh, yellow.
Bright yellow flash, yeah. And again, it's one of those perceptions where I can't really speak for anything beyond what I saw. And of course, anyone who does things like long-term truck driving will tell you see things late at night when you're driving and all that sort of thing. But nonetheless, it led me think, at the time I was maybe 22 or something at the time, and it led me think, okay, people legitimately having that experience, maybe it was something, maybe it wasn't, I can't actually tell because all I've had is this fleeting glance for maybe only a couple of seconds on the road, in headlights, 2 in the morning, driving up to see my folks who were living in Ballarat at the time.
Sorry about that. At least we know our alarm system is working.
Yeah. So, any other questions? Yeah,
What you're saying about sightings and movement of animals and so on,
yeah.
there's a defined thing happening in some places now with the prolonged drive of rural animals moving into urban areas because of available food. And one of the classic pathways, I suppose one of a better word, is down the Yarra or down the Maribyrnong, to the extent that there's now a defined colony of urban foxes living in the docks area of Melbourne.
Yeah.
And they move up and down, particularly the Maribyrnong and the Yarra, and there's other areas, and of course then there's the other aspect of the flying foxes who are relocated out of Botanic Gardens into the area in Heidelberg as well, which is leading to a lot of misreporting and strange sightings.
One line put to me about this, and I think it was put to me by a colleague of mine at work, and I think she was definitely onto something. One issue that's complicating this is getting a lot of people who are moving from urban areas to the boundaries of rural areas, and the people who aren't familiar with the wildlife and animals and so on live there. So there's a story a while back. I had some friends about me. I got the story first when their son was writing on Facebook going, "Oh my God, he's being murdered." Anyway, the story ends up actually being about fox screams. But if you've never heard a fox scream before, it can be really scary. They had stories of, their goat got killed and you hear fox screams and you see odd tracks you're not familiar with. You can put what I call the Gestalt effect. You put a whole heap of different features together and think it's one animal. Particularly when you combine, let's say you get a stag hound's killed a sheep and then foxes have gotten in, and you're hearing the fox screams and you're seeing a large feral cat at a distance, it can create the illusion of there being one animal when it's actually a whole heap of different features. But again, I've got stacks even from, forest rangers and all that sort of thing of sightings. The problem is you can't speak for someone else's sightings. It doesn't work on its own as evidence. It's second tier evidence, and what you need is what Simon's talking about. You need things like DNA, scats, definitive material. I've seen some great studies in the UK on this, similar myths in the UK, where they talk about going out and looking at the toothpick data of how animals have been killed and measuring the size of the canines that have been used to kill them. It's quite effective. Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt and stop the questioning right here, but we have really pushed way far out on our time, considering the fact that it's almost 9 o'clock and the evening was supposed to wind up at 9. So, and we still have one more speaker to go, so I really thank you, David. Please, a round of applause for him.